The take five for 6.8 was lots of review. First two questions were straight from your notes. And then the third one, our theme for the semester, the impact of modernity. Modern technology like railroads and other transportation and steamships. Communication like telegraphs. Medical advances like quinine to treat malaria. But then also modern ideas. The idea of British superiority or European superiority based on race. All of these motives that we have been talking about for the entire unit. In 6.7, we started talking about China. In 6.7, we started talking about China. And we will continue that now. We talked about how the British had introduced opium into China to force them to trade, and that millions of Chinese citizens were addicted. And these three major events that resulted. The first were the Opium Wars. What happened was that China closes its ports to all trade, and as a result, there are British ships sort of locked in or blocked into the ports in China. To demonstrate sort of this absolute anger and horror over all of this opium that was coming into China, the Chinese blow up the British ships. Because remember, the Chinese did invent gunpowder. So all of this opium that the British had cultivated in India and transported all of that distance is now destroyed. And like we saw with the Sepoy Rebellion, when business investments and business interests are threatened, the government gets involved. So the British Navy is sent to China, and they technologically are far superior than the Chinese. Remember, the Chinese were still in an old-fashioned traditional society. They had not had an industrial revolution. So the British Navy is going to kick the Chinese butts all over the use of. As a result, they must sign a treaty. As at the end of any war, a treaty is signed. In this case, because the British won in such a huge way, they really get to determine all of the passages and the different clauses of this treaty. These are known as the unequal treaties because the power was so skewed towards the British. These are called the unequal treaties because Britain has so much power, and they use that to create a treaty that really abuses the Chinese. This is right after the Opium Wars. One element of the treaty is that the Chinese are forced to open their ports to European trade. Remember, they wanted to stay isolated. They did not want to interact with other countries, but now they must. They also need to pay for all of the opium that they destroyed, because remember, the British cultivated, transported it, all of that, and so now the Chinese are forced to pay for this drug that they never wanted in the first place. They also have to give up control of Hong Kong. Hong Kong is on the southeast coast of China. It is one of the world's best natural ports, so it is going to cripple China's ability to develop its own economy, because it will go to British control through a 99-year lease, and Britain doesn't have to pay any rent. So essentially they are taking control of this small territory for 99 years because it sounds less than 100. And last is this clause called extraterritoriality, meaning that Europeans who will end up in China through their business interests don't need to follow the laws of China, but that they will be judged by the laws of their home country. So we had the example in class. If a British man is walking down the street and he murders a Chinese man, if he were to be judged in a Chinese court, of course they would convict him. Not only is it wrong, but he's European. He's sort of the enemy. But what would happen with extraterritoriality is he will be judged by the people of his country. And they'll see, I was like, well, he's one of us, and they would get him off as not guilty. So we have the Chinese with a decreased ability to have an independent society. They are forced to trade with other countries. They are forced to pay for the opium, and they have all these Europeans now sort of wreaking havoc in their country. The third and last event is the Boxer Rebellion. This is about 50 years after the unequal treaties. So China has been living under this unequal, unfair system We had all these European companies and European missionaries coming to China, and the Chinese are fed up with it. And in Chinese culture, your ancestors are incredibly important. So there is a group of martial artists, essentially, who have been practicing kung fu, and they sort of develop this belief that the spirits of their ancestors will come down and help rid China of these foreigners. And they start attacking European businessmen and European missionaries. And again, just like in India and in the Opium Wars, when your citizens are involved, when your economy is challenged, the other governments send their militaries. And in this case, it's multiple countries. The Japanese and the Americans and the British all send their armies. So once again, the Chinese are defeated, and the British punish them for attempting to be free of these unequal treaties. One of the biggest ways they do this is by resetting the lease on Hong Kong. So resetting it from 1898, and that means that Hong Kong does not return to Chinese control until 1997. That's it for China. We're going to move along. That's it for China. We're going to move along to Japan. Similarly, Japan at this time was a very traditional, old-fashioned society. By the 1800s, they were still using feudalism, just like we saw in Europe, or you saw in ninth grade history in Europe with the serfs and the knights and the nobles and the king. Same thing existed in Japan. They just have a different names for it all. Like China, they were not interested in trading with these other countries until the mid-1850s, when Commodore Matthew Perry shows up. Now, in this case, this is an American, not a European, and this is sort of demonstrating America's ability to sort of step into the power struggle over colonies. Matthew Perry sails into Tokyo Harbor with the white flag up. Now, the white flag can be used for surrender or to say, "I come in peace." And he uses this to sort of trick the Japanese, and in a way he essentially fires on them. He forces the Japanese to open up to trade, and this episode sort of becomes known as the Black Ships. For the Americans, this is very positive, opening up a new location for trade. For the Japanese, it is very negative because they were forced to do something they didn't want to do in the first place, but now they have a choice. Should they try and fight? Should they try and prevent Western interaction, or should they cooperate? And Japan decides to cooperate, unlike their neighbor China. This all happens under the Meiji era, so named after Emperor Meiji. He is Japanese, but you notice he has a very Western-style beard and Western-style uniform. Under Emperor Meiji is massive modernization and westernization of Japan. Their industrial revolution takes only 2 decades. They learn from Europe, they learn from America, and they take all of those innovations and make them happen very quickly. Their goal in doing this was to not lose power the way China did. And you can see in this cartoon we already looked at that Japan is actually included in the powerful nations. China had resisted, and they were sort of made to pay for that. Japan cooperates and sort of tries to get on an even playing field with the other European countries. One way that Japan is going to demonstrate this new power is in the neighborhood. They want to be the most powerful Asian country. So they will invade the Korean peninsula, and they will fight over this Chinese territory called Manchuria. The Japanese call it Manchukuo. This leads to the Sino-Japanese War, China versus Japan. And again, China was stuck in the past. Japan had modernized. So Japan wins this war and really starts showing the neighborhood, showing the other countries in the region that they are the superior country. But Russia does not take too kindly to this. It's Mother Russia. They are always excellent, aren't they? They're really big. Yes, it's cold and it's full of Russians. But they cannot believe that this essentially new country is competing for power. And And both Japan and Russia will fight over the port city of Vladivostok. Now, technically, it is on Chinese territory. Both Russia and Japan want Vladivostok. Russia, in particular, is interested in it because it wants a warm water port. Russia, number two, is freaking cold, and many of their ports freeze over for part of the year. Also, having a port on the east coast will allow them to expand their empire in new locations. Japan is interested in it for the same reasons. They want a really good port. They also want to demonstrate to others that they have power. And this is a great example of spheres of influence. Attempting to make your presence felt in the region. It's sort of like a Venn diagram. And that overlapping area is usually where war happens. In this case, it's called the Russo-Japanese War. The world is a little bit shocked that this small island nation that only recently became modernized would dare go up against Russia. But Russia really hadn't modernized at all. The last innovations they had came from Peter the Great in the 1700s. So because the Japanese had modernized and had an industrial revolution, they are able to totally defeat the Russians. And the Russian people, all of those Russians, cannot believe that. They are so incredibly upset that the Tsar would allow Russia to be defeated, that the Russian people start protesting and they revolt. And this is called the Russian Revolution of 1905. It's not the main Russian Revolution, but it's sort of the prequel. And the Russian people start realizing that there are so many of them, and that if they are displeased with the way their country is governed, they have a voice. Then the Tsar listens to them and actually sort of makes some changes to the way Russia works. So because Japan modernized, because they had a modern society, a modern military, they become the most powerful in the region. And America will feel the power of that in 1941. That's it for 6.8.